Now, Tom, when you work in audio, what made you decide to make a move and join GV?
I still love IDEO. They've been incredibly generous to me. While I was there, I started things like OpenIDEO. We span out Armada Health. We had various other spin-outs.
What is OpenIDEO?
So OpenIDEO is, so if we start with design thinking, which are the sort of core pillars of what IDEO does. So IDEO believes that to create a new business, you have to have this kind of approach of empathy. And there's a few ways it happens. So the first we've talked about is kind of customer centricity. So keep the customer at the heart of the business. So some ways to do that these guys might be able to relate to. If you're not the customer yourself, and in software we call that eating your own dog food, if you're not the customer yourself, make sure your customer is in your business in some way, either employed or ideally as a sort of representative customer. So that's the first thing, really easy, that we would do. The second thing we would do is we would increase empathy for those customers by kind of living like our customer and going through the whole workflow. And one of the things that startups forget is you are part, usually a very small part, of a very long customer journey, and you're as good or as bad as the worst bit of that customer journey. So you have to understand all of it. All of it is a design opportunity. Too many of us kind of optimize one small piece of it, and we're driven. We're sort of the worst point of the experience becomes what defines us. So that's the second thing that we do. The third thing that we do is we always have diverse teams. So, ideally we would have gender diverse teams, ethnicity diverse, and absolutely skills diverse as well. Because usually, if you want to solve a tough problem, it's coming from the intersect of disciplines now. So where you can have a diverse team and different skills represented. And then the next one that we did, which I think is perhaps as important as any of the others, is prototype early. So the most common kind of mistake at these businesses, once the team is going, etc., is they spend too much time trying to perfect their idea. I mean, when I speak to graduates, one of the things that, and actually it's true for kind of people starting businesses, one of the things that I find most frustrating is when they hide their ideas behind closed doors. And the simple truth is ideas are cheap now. I don't believe that I've ever had a unique idea. I mean, by definition, you look at the light bulb, there's absolutely 12 different independent it was invented concurrently. And so, the thinking is prototype early and get your idea out in the wild. I think perfection is the enemy of progress. And so if you guys are trying to perfect something behind closed doors, you're losing the opportunity to get customer feedback. And if you're glamorizing the wrong things, like how long your business plan is, or how many lines of code you've written, and we all become what we measure. If we start to sort of measure those, rather than actually where the customers like what we're doing, it's usually the start of the end, I think.
I agree. How do you apply these learnings of prototyping early in your work, and what you do right now?
So whatever business you're in, you have the potential to prototype early. And actually the wonderful thing about the time that we live in is you can probably pilot, which means actually launch a kind of dummy version of the service. So to give you guys some examples, in software it's obvious. So many of you will know Zinger. Zinger pioneered an approach they call ghetto testing, and that's a business that, as you know, launches games. But what they would do is they would advertise the game before they'd written a line of code. So they would actually get a view of whether there was a market and who would like that product before writing a single line of code. I've got to say, that makes sense in most examples. If you guys are sat there thinking, oh, but we'll let people know what we're doing or something, you can target with £1,000, a really tight, narrow Facebook campaign, YouTube campaign to see if people like it. So that, for me, just hugely important. Then you can probably say to yourself, well, I work in a hardware company, I work in an IoT company, I saw one of the questions. You can do it as well. Like someone I really admire and known for a while, Tim Ferriss, and his work's really interesting. When he was writing his first book, The 4-Hour Work Week, which he was terrified whether that would be a success, he sat in Borders in Palo Alto with a cup of coffee, because there's usually a sort of Starbucks in there or something, and he just sneaked his book with different covers on onto the new release table to see which people would pick up. Like, there are ways of prototyping even hardware. You can easily mock up an advert. You can easily actually advertise hardware. I would say Kickstarter, in a weird way, is a piloting or prototyping tool to get market feedback.
It is, and when you have, I'm sure you must have lots of emails coming to you. How do you focus your mind on the real gems? Where do you come from? Do you come from your friends suggesting you to look at the company, or you look at your inbox, or how do you find those companies which you end up investing later?
So like all of you guys, my email seems to be exponentially rising, so it's getting harder and harder. So I have to have some kind of filters. There's a social filter there, where there's certain people that I've worked with before, or there's founders I've backed repeatedly, and I'll continue to do that. There's no substitute for that. That's my favourite. Then there's investors that I've worked with that are a social filter, and if it comes, if something comes through them, I absolutely trust it, and I sort of defer judgment and take a meeting. And then, I try and be a bit proactive about sectors. So there's usually certain sectors that I have a thesis around, and I'm more likely to take a meeting if it's in line with that thesis. And then I guess the final one, which we can talk about in a bit, we don't invest at the seed stage, so there's usually some stuff for us to look at that we think might be a leading indicator for success. So in a way, it was much harder when I was an angel investor, because everyone can write an email about a business they're about to start, than it is now I'm at GV, where I'm actually looking for some kind of traction.
And do you still angel invest?
I've only done a couple of deals in the last 3 years, so essentially no. And that's just to keep my life simple. I don't want to have investments in companies that I want GV to look at in the future and be conflicted. So I'm spending as much time as I can to make my life simpler. It's kind of a big goal. I feel like I said that. That was probably one of my resolutions at the start of this year, and I give myself a 2 out of 10 on that. Hopefully next year I'm going to make my life a bit simpler, and so angel investing definitely doesn't do that.
So just focus on the professional side of GV. Do you also advise companies, or you mentor anybody?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we will often identify a company that we think is exciting and have a relationship with that company for months, or even occasionally years before we invest. So that's something important to us. I mean, we try and differentiate ourselves, I think, in 2 ways. The first is we have an amazing operations team, or operation partners, that actually support the portfolio. So we've got amazing designers, as good a caliber as IDEO, just world-class thinkers on design, machine learning experts, PR, hiring, comms, and they lend their support to our portfolio. Sometimes they'll lend support to companies that we think are sort of high trajectory before we invest. So that's one, an operational team. And I think the other way we add value, or we're differentiated, is by offering introductions to alphabet companies. And we can talk about that as well, but that's very ranging, as you know. You've got Waymo, YouTube, Google, Verily, Calico, DeepMind. So I cannot think of a single example of one of our investments where they haven't had a kind of great conversation with someone in an alphabet company.
Yeah. What I like about GV is the fact that you have a wide range of networks, not only inside the group, but also outside. Do you have any outside advisors which you approach for advice if you going into a niche which you don't understand properly, or you want to understand better?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my default assumption is that I'm kind of an idiot in pretty much every industry. And so one of the things I've been careful to do is surround myself with people that I can trust. And I have imposter syndrome kind of most weeks, if not most days. So I genuinely will sit in front of people and think I don't actually kind of deserve to be sat in front of them. And often what they're talking about is kind of unbelievably complex, and I'm probably 20% up that curve in most industries. But one of the things I found really rewarding is, often these entrepreneurs or these very highly technical people feel exactly the same way about other stuff, and that might be stuff that I'm a little bit smarter on. So, you know, when I wanted to understand, I decided to be proactive about genomics, and I surrounded myself with world-class people in genomics, and I consider a lot of them really good friends now. We have regular conversations, and then we also have a venture partner network. So, you know, we have a life science team at GV. We're kind of increasing our life science investing by proportion of kind of funds, and they're often venture partners. I mean, they're truly amazing human beings. The guy, Krishna Yeshwant, who runs the life science team, is a practicing medic. He's a full-time investor. I mean, he's a full-time kind of at about 3 different roles. So amazing human being, juggles that stuff.
So you mentioned life sciences, you mentioned genomics, you did some deals in fintech.
Yeah.
What are you excited about, which is upcoming next?
So look, you know, you guys are sat here in the city of London. Fintech is unbelievably exciting. It's exciting because it's opening up to consumer choice. It's exciting because the incumbents have often technical legacy infrastructure which is expensive to change. So, you know, often you'll hear startups laugh at big companies because, you know, there's a cheaper way to do it. It's actually entirely the wrong way to view it. Clay Christensen wrote an amazing book on innovation called The Innovator's Solution. The precursor was The Innovator's Dilemma, and The Innovator's Dilemma is simply the point that if you have 10,000 IT people and work in a bank, it's bloody expensive to get rid of them and get rid of the infrastructure, so it's irrational to do that. So, you know, there are real Achilles heels in these organisations that startups can attack, and one of the things that we haven't seen in fintech that I'm excited about is there are, within a mile of where we're all sat here today, there's 20 plus companies that can acquire companies for $1 billion plus. And so you've got this kind of perfect storm of technological disruption, consumers making choices or having the freedom to choose, consumers benchmarking other surfaces like the Apples of the world and expecting that standard of service, great potential acquirers, incredible talent. And so fintech is one. We can talk about our investments in fintech if it's interesting, but you know, I'm excited about computer vision at the moment, autonomous vehicles I'm looking at. I'm part of a team inside GV that's sort of proactively looking at that space. AR, VR, we think is early, but...
Let's talk about it for a second. How much is DeepMind helping out in this space? Because as far as I know, Dennis, the founder CEO, he did a PhD in computer vision, and he was investigating how our minds see images, and that's apparently how he started DeepMind, and he wanted to evolve it. Is DeepMind doing any help in this space?
Where he transitioned from computer science into looking at the brain, exactly neuroscience, because he believed that that may be the way to solve intelligence, which is his objective at DeepMind. The idea that actually you can have a general AI, and if you look at the progress this week that they've announced with AlphaZero, which basically relies on zero human training data. I mean, there's some strong arguments that, you know, he's getting there, still a long way off, but he's getting there. Have a look at, I don't know if any of you follow chess, but I was with Demis last night at a chess event, and DeepMind have applied the AlphaZero algorithm to chess, and it has a completely novel approach to playing. It's kind of beautiful, it's creative. So you'll find those articles online. I'll try and remember to tweet a couple out afterwards. They're extraordinary. But, you know, DeepMind's, they're close friends, and I'm a huge fan of Demis, one of the most impressive people I've ever met. I will reach out to him to ask advice and ideas, but I do that with people that are outside Alphabet as well. He's kind of top of my list, or top of a sort of handful of people that I would trust on anything AI above all others. He's amazing.
When it comes to your game in terms of autonomous, GV invested in both Uber as well as Lyft. What is your game, or was it Google directly?
No. So Google Ventures or GV invested in Uber a few years ago, and Google Capital, and I'll explain that difference in a moment, invested in Lyft. So at GV, we kind of make venture stage investments. So, you know, the average check size we've written in Europe this year has been about $10 million. Google Capital is more like private equity. They're called Capital G now as part of the reorganisation, and they recently invested in Lyft. And we make independent financial investment decisions. We often co-invest with them. We've got some great examples of that, like Oscar Health or Stripe. But at the moment, they've chosen to invest in a different company. It's kind of a healthy tension.
Who do you think are the world leaders in terms of autonomous? Would you consider Waymo one of them?
Yeah, I mean, look, the juries, I think you have to have a thesis on autonomous vehicles. So, some of this is my own rather than Alphabet, but we think it's still a few years off for level 5 autonomy. So most of the technology's there, and you've got some companies that are approaching this from kind of level 1 autonomy upwards. So Tesla's an amazing example of this. Like Tesla are kind of doing a glorified autopilot and working up the levels of autonomy. Level 5 autonomy, for those of you that don't follow the space, means there's no longer a steering wheel in the car, it's entirely autonomous. And Waymo, with a sort of LiDAR-centric approach, which is a way of sort of judging distance and building a map around you, are kind of going level 5 autonomy down. So I think to be determined, I would say from that perspective, level 5 autonomy down, as far as I can tell, Waymo are absolutely the leaders. Phenomenal technical team, but there's a few different kind of strategic approaches to attacking that market, and it's unclear which will win. I think one of the fun questions to ask yourselves, if you wanted to think about who was going to win in that market, is do you think that self-driving car technology is going to be more like ABS, like the automated braking systems, in which case all of the OEMs are kind of going to build their own system, in which case you have to expect the technology commoditizes a bit for that to be true? Or do you believe it's so difficult that one company will build the stack and kind of license it into everyone? So that might look a bit more like Android, for example, where you have millions of applications of the same core code base. And I have my own opinion. We'll see which is true.
Okay. GB is based in a bunch of cities. One of them is London. And you seem to be focused and excited about Europe. Where do you see Europe being ahead of the game compared to other places around the world?
So one of the things I find most frustrating is, and I'm grateful you didn't ask this question, the most common question I get on this subject is, how do we make a Silicon Valley of Europe? Or how do we make London the next Silicon Valley? And we've been hearing that question for 5 years. I think it's the wrong question. I think we should phrase it exactly as you did, which is to ask ourselves, what are our unfair advantages? And so we've just talked about fintech. I think London is as good a place as anywhere on the planet to start a fintech business. If you look at the other kind of hubs of excellence, I think there's some interesting drone stuff happening in Zurich at the moment because of the technical colleges, and I hope in the UK in the future. I think if you're interested in gaming, it's really tough to look further than the Nordics. You've got Rovio, Supercell, a lot of those early employees are now founding companies. They're unbelievably expert. They're close to angel investors who have made money from those exits. So I think you get this kind of multiplier effect. As you saw in the Valley when Facebook created hundreds of millionaires at liquidity who became angel investors, you're starting to see that in specific sectors in Europe, which is exciting.
When it comes to your deals from Europe, what seems to be the main topic for you this year? What are you focusing on? Are you just going wide?
Look, we're generalist investors. There's computer vision at the moment, but we're also generalists. We're reactive to those sort of high growth companies, and we'd like to track them for months or years, as I mentioned. So next year I think you can expect to see us invest in some of those technical businesses in Europe, but also keep an open mind to all the other good stuff.
What are your priorities? Are you looking at the founder? Are you looking at the growth? What is the most important thing to you, or which things are you looking at when deciding whether to invest or not?
Yeah, look, it's subject to stage. I think one of the common mistakes, having raised capital as a founder, I think one of the mistakes I made, if I look back, I thought that all of the kind of investor meetings I was having, all they cared about was the industry. I now know, sitting the other side of the table, that actually they were just testing me. They were testing my understanding of the industry. Because, the vast majority of times, a seed stage business, the idea changes. So all you've got at that stage really is the team. So I have a preference to see a team that's already formed, because, and you guys know this, you know, teams are high pressure, early stage businesses are high pressure. If it was easy, what you're doing, everyone would be doing it, and it would have no value. So by definition, if we want to invest, it's difficult. And if it's difficult, by definition, it means there's going to be a real strain and pressure. And I don't want to take the team risk on, or I want to de-risk the team risk in any way I can. And so I look for formed relationships. You know, the dream is founders that have worked together before, but we often will look at like the team dynamic. We want diversity, but we also want founders that kind of trust and respect each other. Ideally like each other, although I think some exceptions to that rule. It's going to be interesting if anyone nods in the audience on that. They get punched afterwards. But the you know, the team is important. And over time, in a startup, more cards are turned over. So, you know, next after the team, hopefully you've got a prototype and we can start to look for product market fit or validation of the idea. So that's customer effect. There might be competitors that we can then look at. And then over time, again, we start to look at churn and how much customers are willing to pay and whether actually they really care about what you're doing over time. Yeah. And so you just get more cards with the stage of the deal.
So you can solve it one thing at a time. When it comes to team, what are some warning signs which you pay really close attention to?
So I think a lot of investors hate founders contradicting each other in meetings. I'm actually okay with that as long as you don't see animosity between them as a result. I quite like a creative tension. I think in my businesses historically at various times, I've been most productive with people that I had a creative tension with, that kept me on my toes, that I actually thought I had to be on my A game in front of. And so I don't mind, you know, the odd contradiction, etc. But I want to see a team that care about the vision and they are united around what the vision is. Often you'll see kind of founders that clearly think that one of them thinks this is a temporary role and the other thinks they're going to be there forever. And you know, the final one is you should have open-minded. You have to be dogmatic as an entrepreneur. They have to be open-minded to changing information. So you know, you do get teams that will discount information that's shared with them in meetings, and that's a terrible signal.
It is. And now that you found the team, the market is big, the product makes sense, do you prefer to co-invest with trusted partners or you go in alone?
Yeah, we're hardly ever the first institutional money. So we, you know, usually form part of the syndicate. I think that's healthy because it keeps us on our toes and them on their toes. And actually, you know, the best investors out there complement one another often. I still have a lot to learn, and so I enjoy being on a board and working with the very best investors where I can. I think.
Who do you consider to be the best investors? I mean, it's not VC. Those companies are just you know, people. Like is it Ron Conway? Is it
Look, that's an important point. To some extent, your relationship with the individual is more important than the firm, because it is a marriage. You know, you have to make sure that you sign a sort of, you know, agreement, a funding agreement, etc. The more important thing with your investor is a social contract of what you want to achieve together, and you want an individual that you can be honest with. You can actually kind of think through challenges, etc. And so you don't just look at the firm, you have to also look at the partner. I think one of my first investors said to me, there's actually a couple of kind of good pieces of advice he gave me, which I've shared a bit since, and I think it really helped me. So the first one he said is he reminded me that, and he sort of drew a curve, and he said, you're coming to me today naive but incredibly optimistic about what you want to build. We talked about how what you're doing needs to be difficult. So you're going to go through a period of realization that it's bloody difficult. And those are the toughest periods. Now, if you're willing to keep going at it and learn fast, then you'll emerge at the other side and you'll be informed and optimistic. And so he said, I'm investing you on the basis that you're going to keep going through that trough. And I think some of us are sort of overvaluing pivots at the moment. Some people think pivots are progress in some way, but you have to be realistic and say, okay, I'm not going to do it if it's not working. Be open-minded to that. But founders that celebrate that they've had 3 pivots, as though that means they're somehow close to the goal, I question. It's not true. The other bit of advice which he gave me, which might be useful for these guys, is there are basically 3 types of investors. You've got dumb investors that know they're dumb, and I mean kind of passive. I don't mean dumb in a derogatory way.
They're just the money, right?
Yeah, they're just the money and they know they're just the money. You've got smart investors that know they're smart. They're going to add value. And then you've got dumb investors that think they're smart. Like, you can take money from 1 or 2. The passive that know they're passive, or dumb that know they're dumb. Smart that think they're dumb. You know, occasionally happens. But certainly you want to make sure that you've got the smart ones that know they're smart, because they're going to help you win. Just avoid the ones that, you know, the investors that don't know what they're doing but think they do, because they'll just hoover up all of your time. I've had those on my cap table before. I think I did an okay job of listening to him, but, you know, I had room for improvement on that occasion.
That's interesting. You're just doing a deal with somebody who built 2 businesses, sold them for $500,000, and what the person is very cautious of are investors who are alpha dogs, as he calls them. Did you come across this?
So define, is it alpha dog?
You know, it's people.
I've never heard that expression, so keen to learn.
So alpha males, basically. So somebody who's trying to tell you what to do, and
I strongly agree. Like, if it's, and you detect that quickly, and actually, you know, I would say an example of investors that, you know, some of these examples of investors that perhaps have room for improvement and kind of can cause trouble in business are the ones that are constantly trying to switch out the CEO but not prepared to do the job themselves.
Okay.
Or, you know, are too aggressive and kind of speculative, or form opinions based on no information at all and hold to those opinions whatever. You know, I'm still amazed that you get people that will show up at board meetings without reading the board papers.
Are there any investors which you would not invest with? I mean, don't they companies, it's just the concept of, you know, somebody is not so smart, but they think they are, and they just tend to mess up.
There's clearly some that I've come across that I would prefer not to invest with, and I think I'd probably never invest with under any circumstance. And, you know, there may be people out there that feel that way about me.
Okay. Now, after you invest, what would you see is the biggest value how GV adds to the companies they invest in?
So that we take a long-term view. We've talked about how we have great operations teams. I love rolling up my sleeves and kind of getting involved with the business and thinking through new products, etc. But joining GV has been humbling for me, because previously I would say I was, you know, I'm not bad at product, but we have world-class product and design people on staff. So it's just a caliber of people there that support the portfolio that is inspiring for me to see. You know, someone asked a question way back there around sprint. So one of the GV design partners, or the GV design team, actually wrote a book about a process called sprint, which is basically the design thinking methodology. It's a great book for what it's worth. For any of you that don't consider yourself designers, it's just got some great hacks and shortcuts to doing the sort of human-centric stuff, doing the prototyping and iteration, etc. And, you know, these guys are at the top of their game adding value. I'm lucky to be able to work with some of them.
Yeah. So when you invest, how do you work with individual companies? Do you let them ask for help, or you proactively seek the opportunities how you could be helping them?
The best founders are self-aware. So I find, you know, my portfolio is 12 companies at the moment for GV, and most of those founders call me rather than me calling them.
Okay.
And for me, that's a sign of a great founder. They should know my strengths and my weaknesses and know when to apply me, and they feel the same way about the kind of rest of the GV team. There's nothing I like more than on our internal system to get a notification that, for example, one of our engineering team has spent a whole bunch of time with one of my portfolio companies, and I didn't even know it was happening. Okay. That's a dream. That's properly leveraged. I love it.
So when you invest, how many people or how many companies do you see from those which you invest in? So what are the statistics, the funnel in your case?
Yeah, the funnel. So look, this is, so I do track it, but I give you sort of, I'd say speculative. So I probably get 100 inbound opportunities a week. I mean, seriously, and this is kind of to me or to the European team, I would say. But for every 1,000 inbound opportunities, I think we kind of, dig into a deck on probably 100. We probably take 10 meetings, and we probably make one investment. It's very speculative, it's roughly. It's a pretty steep-sided funnel.
Yeah. And those meetings are informal, or this is just investment committee deciding on the company?
Do I look like a formal person?
Thank you very much, yes.
I dressed up. So yeah, I'm not.
Just forgot to go today.
I don't. Yeah, exactly. I don't. Oh, you're a star. Thank you for your help. I'm not a formal person, so at the point of investing, we'll have a partner meeting, and the company will pitch. But the pitches that work best, my partners are asking questions during the presentation. It'll often become a sort of, I don't want to use the word brainstorming, but we'll often think through the business in real time together. I would say we're at the informal end of the spectrum.
Okay, now looking at the VC industry and the future of that, where do you see the VC industry heading towards, and how do you see it changing in the upcoming years?
There's a spectacular amount of capital out there. We're in a low interest rate environment for a long time. Startups are basically sexy for graduates. I did an MBA in the States, and very famously, this organisation is seen as a sort of leading indicator of industries that are going to be in trouble. And certainly when I went there, investment banking was the big sort of dream job for most people, and currently it's startups, which might end badly. So there's, I'd say, probably too much capital out there, potentially. Yeah, I think there's a lot of capital. I mean, some people will, and this is an interesting question to sort of run through. A lot of people will talk about how there's a Series A funding gap, etc. I think I was lucky enough to work with Number 10, thinking through EIS and SEIS to help angel in seed stage investing, and that worked really well, and sort of created a whole raft of startups that are now looking for professional investors. And some of them, they're not a fit for professional investing. So it's unclear to me whether there's a Series A gap or there's a bunch of startups that are kind of struggling because fundraising should be difficult.
Yeah.
Where's VC going? I think it's interesting that right now venture is a bundled offer. So all of my conversation this evening has been around how we bundle capital and advice and support and network. And it's not clear to me that it wouldn't be, there isn't an end state in the future where those are passed.
Yeah.
And so, some people think that ICOs might open up kind of low friction source of funding, and then founders can pick their advisors, and maybe you'll see the unbundling of venture. But the best firms, cross generations of partners, the kind of, the Sequoias, the Benchmarks, the Excels, the indexes here in Europe, you see them bringing on great partners. They're going to be around for a long, long time.
True. It's interesting you mentioning ICOs. Would you consider ICOs potentially as a disruption to your industry?
100%. I mean, I think estimates are $3 billion going into ICOs this year. They're taking the friction out of fundraising. They get bundled in with cryptocurrency. I think they're more like crowdfunding, which we can talk about if it's interesting to everyone. But it's absolutely a disruptive force. And like most of these technologies, they're often, William Gibson said, the future is here, it's just unevenly distributed. There's going to be aspects of it that roll across to the main market. I think that's inevitable. But one of the interesting things we have is when we all, and we've been looking at cryptocurrency and blockchain a lot recently. We invested in blockchain.info here in London, which is the biggest non-custodial cryptocurrency wallet on the planet. And the more we looked at blockchain, the more you see it everywhere. One of my engineering partners, Eric Norland, has summed it up really well, which is When you've got a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And our job is to kind of wade through all of the, ICOs for the good opportunity, or wade through all of the distributed ledger businesses for the times it makes sense, rather than a database.
So, talking about the blockchain, these technologies, would you recommend to somebody to do an ICO if it's a blockchain business, or not yet? Or you don't see any problems with the level of regulation, for example?
Look, I'll give you a kind of balance sheet of how I think about it if I was an entrepreneur. So the first thing is, on the plus side, it's very low touch, low friction, but I would have a strong point of view that regulation is coming. I mean, I think we've seen, whether you look at the financial markets, equities, you look at crowdfunding, I would expect to see similar rules implemented. So just because it's low friction now doesn't mean it's going to be in the future. Second question I would ask myself is whether there's a good overlap between my customers or my investors and those that are likely to be able to buy ICOs. Because usually Bitcoin is the convert currency. And so a lot of these businesses, if you don't think that the types of people that you can raise from are already deeply comfortable with cryptocurrency, then you're basically narrowing your market dramatically. So I'd be really careful on that point. I think it's important. And then, I'm kind of open-minded to it, but I go back to one of the things that I observed with crowdfunding and, conflating two of our conversations this evening, the idea that actually it's taking the friction out of raising investment, and you've got to be careful with your investors to say, with crowdfunding, the best people that raise have a clear social contract. Like, if you do an ICO, be clear about how you're going to keep in touch with those people. Be clear about whether you're going to have a sort of annual general meeting with them, etc. Because, the regulation will come, and it can become a massive pain if you've got 5,000 shareholders all wanting a little slither of your time.
Sure. Have any of you considered ICOs? How many of you are fundraising or going to fundraise in the next few months? Raise your hand. Okay, there's a few of you. Anybody considers ICOs as a valid option? A few hands. Okay, interesting. So ICO is one of them. The next one is blockchain. You mentioned that. I saw you talk about Bitcoin being one of the most successful startups of this age. So it's basically value-wise, right? It's a big
market cap. I mean, Bitcoin today is, if you think of it as a startup, is a $270 billion business that was formed in the last 8 years.
Do you have any Bitcoins?
I do.
Okay, and you're going to keep them, or you?
I am definitely not giving investment advice, but I have sold some. And the important thing is be comfortable losing whatever you hold in any cryptocurrency. But I would say, look, it's interesting. Bitcoin. All of us should have an interest in Bitcoin. It's like for each generation, if you're lucky, there's kind of one transformatory technology, and I think we've got a few. Genomics, I think, is an example. AI is an example, and I think blockchain and cryptocurrency are an example. So I feel unbelievably lucky to be kind of in the middle of the storm or the whirlwind generationally of this stuff happening. I do think Bitcoin is unbelievably clever. I think the fact that it still has not actually been broken. It's always the exchanges that are single points of failure. But if you look at what needs to be true for Bitcoin to have great utility value, it needs the things that we see in currencies. And those are three things, in my opinion. One is it needs to be a store of value. The second thing is it needs to be a medium of exchange, so I should be able to pay in Bitcoin in some way. And the third thing is it needs to be a unit of exchange. And one of the challenges with the kind of speculation that we see in the price at the moment is, as we're speaking, I bet the price is going from $16,200 to $16,800 to $17,400. And for that reason, it's damaging to kind of currency features 2 and 3, which is medium of exchange and unit of exchange, which is why you've seen Steam pull it off as a way to pay. So, in a way, while the economics are exciting of holding Bitcoin at the moment, I have a slight concern that it's moving away from having utility value.
Okay, now before we go and look at the questions from the audience, can you tell us something about AI and where do you see AI influencing mankind in the next upcoming years, and how does this affect what you do?
So it's an incredibly general subject. It's like asking us the sort of same with the raw material that goes into AI, which is data 10 years ago. I read everything I can on AI and still of the mind that the sort of AGI to ASI inflection point is still kind of well over a decade away.
Okay.
But I defer to smarter people than me like Dennis Hassabis on that subject. Now, the narrow applications of AI should be more interesting and more relevant to all of us right now, because if you have a deep learning system, it's a black box, it's unaccountable, and you've seen poor, I think, ethical applications of that. For example, with judiciary software in the US that are actually discriminating. The algorithms are effectively discriminating based on training data. I think we all have to be responsible about narrow AI, and we should be thinking through the sort of ethics of algorithms a lot more. I mean, a simple example for you, I study physics. I'm at the geeky end of the spectrum. I have technology at my fingertips now which gives me more leverage than any generation before us, even the smartest people of the generations before us, and I've never done an ethics course. It's pretty extraordinary, actually. There's a sort of a default assumption, libertarian assumption that it'll only be harnessed for good. I think we all have to, instead of being completely binary, it's like some people think it's a disaster and others think it can only be harnessed for good, realise that actually technology is just a tool. The tool is more impactful than it's ever been before in human history, and so we have to start thinking about the sort of range of ways it might be applied for good or bad.
Interesting. I agree. The narrow AI is really influencing us. It's way better than people are. In some cases, the general stuff is coming later. It doesn't make you nervous.
It does make me nervous because I think there's most tools should make us nervous. Guns make me nervous. The challenge is, I think, often those impacted more abstracted away from AI, and so people don't think, it's back to this empathy point. I think it's actually, when you're writing algorithms, it's easier to not be empathic to those that will be either the beneficiaries or the victims of the algorithm than it has been most tools previously in human history. And so I think we need to be thoughtful about that. I think with my kids, our educations are pretty mediocre in this world of AI. If you think of the stuff that our kids, the stuff, my kids are optimizing for rote learning. They're optimizing for remembering stuff. That's insane. You're basically picking the one thing that all machines are already superhuman at, instead of sort of challenging questions, challenging where sources of data are, etc. So, it does make me nervous. Yeah. It makes me nervous about how it's applied, and it makes me nervous because I think our education system is appallingly equipped for that new reality.
Do you plan to make your own kindergarten like Elon Musk did with his colleagues?
I'm not. He's an unbelievably thoughtful human being, and where he says his kids are very happy there. I'd love to kind of hear their point of view on this subject, but there's smarter people than me thinking through that challenge, but it's a real one.
Okay, let's look at the questions from you, the audience. The question is, Anonymous asks, does GB plan to invest in blockchain-related projects? Are there any plans to transform GB into crypto coin-based VC? You already mentioned blockchain.info, you invested, right?
Yeah, we also invested in LedgerX, which you can see in the US has just launched futures and options on crypto. That was a few years ago. And we also invested in Ripple, but not the coin. We invested in the business itself. So look, we are passionate about the space, eager to learn more. Theoretically, we can invest in ICOs, although kind of from a legal perspective, it would take a bit more work to get comfortable with it. Today, we're not.
And the second part of the questions is, any plans to transform GV into cryptocurrency VC?
I mean, a crypto coin-based VC is sort of interesting. I assume that means issuing like ownership of GV in a coin itself. But look, we're lucky, we only have one LP. So VCs are constructive of LPs who are the money that put the money into the kind of investment vehicle and a standalone fund in our case. And then you have GPs, general partners, that are investing it. And then often partners, etc. And so in our case, we only have one LP. There's no way we would build a bunch of digital coins to give back to Google.
Okay. Next question for someone trying to get into VC. Can you talk about how to put a good investment case together?
So look, VC is three things. It's kind of creating deal flow. So in other words, getting in front of the right people and building trust so that you have deals to review. Then it's selecting those deals, that funnel we just talked about, the steep-sided funnel, and then it's supporting those deals. So it's those three things. So if getting into VC, you want to be absolutely world-class at one of them or great at more than one. And I would be, in my own little way, again, completely accidentally, I'm not smart enough that this was premeditated. I did a bit of all three of those before I went into GV. I was angel investing, that showed I was okay at picking deals. I had a decent network because of the people I was lucky to spend time with, and it was pretty diverse. And the final one is, certainly IDEO, in many ways, is a consultancy. It spends all its time thinking, how do we help people? So I would say, if you're interested in VC, do those three things. The next thing I would say is, don't assume that associates, so junior positions in venture firms, are an easy way to get to be a partner in the venture fund. If you guys are thinking about that, I would actually ask the VC. You should do due diligence on the VC and actually ask how often associates make it to partner level. I think often it's an important and a good thing to do because you figure out if you want to be a VC, which is a good thing to do because it doesn't suit everybody. But assuming you know that, don't assume being an associate is the best.
It's a good indicator, yes.
And actually, that's a good bit of advice that I probably one of the many things I wish I'd known earlier is, as a founder, you should be doing due diligence on your investors. Like, it's unbelievable how few do it. So, and don't just ask for 3 introductions from the VC to their investments, because they're just going to give you the good ones in the same way as you did when they asked you for references. Instead, ask to see a list of all of their portfolio and pick the ones that have struggled or a mix.
I agree. How do you balance empathy with sustainable business plan? Sebi asks.
So, look, it's a great question. And maybe I'm kind of utopian and naive, but I don't think those things are zero-sum or mutually exclusive. Like, I think long-term value is about kind of exceeding the expectations of customers over the long term. It's charging them less than, not just they're willing to pay for something, but charge them less than the value they extract from your product and service. And so I actually think empathy and staying customer-centered is the only way to build a sustainable long-term business. And I think we see this. I mean, in the times that big brands get exposed and the brand collapses incredibly quickly, it's always when they've lost kind of empathy. They are gouging the customer.
Okay, let's take 2 more questions from the audience directly, and then we wrap it up. So, anybody has a question which you want to ask, raise your hand, and you can ask away.
Okay.
Okay, there you go. You stand up then.
Hi, Don. Thanks a lot for being here.
Hang on.
Can you tell us a bit more about computer vision and how you see that being applied?
Yeah, absolutely. So look, there's so computer vision is exciting because there's been incredible breakthroughs recently with deep learning, as you guys will know very well. And actually, it it was a field or applied computer vision, or was often perceived to be kind of unsolvable. We've suddenly seen it solved. And so some areas I see it applied that I'm excited about. One is pathology. Like, it's unbelievable that we still have pathologists reviewing scans to assess whether we have cancer. Like, there's still a role for those people, but often they're actually a bottleneck in the hospital. They're a rate-limiting factor of how many of us can have scans. You know, AI is going to be just as good. Maybe the complement will be even better. So there's one, digital pathology. Next one that's obvious is VR and AR, but not just superimposing stuff in the real world, but actually constructing real 3D maps that we can interact with. So there's some companies at the moment, kind of monocular companies, so single lens companies that can use your smartphone and construct a 3D rendering of this room right now, which we can interact with. That is unbelievably difficult problem to solve in a robust way under different conditions so that you can localize in a SLAM way. So that's another application that I think is really exciting. Computer vision, if you sort of expand the wavelengths, is absolutely foundational to autonomous vehicles. It's going to be absolutely foundational to the sort of inevitable rise of kind of single-person flying cars, vertical takeoff, which is a big investment area at the moment. Drones, avoidance, I mean, it's everywhere.
Okay, last question for tonight. Raise your hand.
Sorry, identification. I mean, that's a hugely interesting one. You've seen some breakthroughs from Apple.
Okay. There you go.
Hi there. I'm just wondering around the corporations. I work for a corporate. We have an innovation arm. Just wondering on GB's connection with corporations. Do you advise? Do you invest with? I think a lot of corporates now are building their own products as well as investing in businesses. So just wondering GB's impact on that.
Yeah, no, good question. So kind of more informed by my time at IDEO, corporations have gone on an interesting journey of kind of initially thinking that the answer needs to be inside the building and they have to have an innovation team launch everything themselves, usually advised by consultancy. There's certain times that makes sense. I think it makes sense when it's a kind of sustaining innovation, so something that the antibodies in the organisation don't reject. The time it doesn't make sense is if it's really disruptive. And for those disruptive innovations, I think, you know, building them, sometimes people say ambidextrously or autonomously is important, building them outside the organisation, or just taking an investment. And so, you know, GV, I guess a few answers to the question. Like, Alphabet has kind of innovation at its heart. I've been absolutely blown away by that. Our job is not strategic return for Alphabet, it's financial return. And, you know, we want to therefore maximise the value of our portfolio companies. And so we'll often lay on days for corporates where we'll introduce them to 5 or 10 of our portfolio companies. So we have a partnerships team that will organise those events, and they're unbelievably successful. Like, we can draw a direct line to value created. And I think the reason for that is the team, led by a guy on the West Coast called Rick Clout, does an amazing job of curating those startups. So the corporates that do well are clear about what their needs are, and then our team does a brilliant job, I think, of curating a few companies for them to meet.
Okay, thank you for the questions. Tom, do you plan to ever build another company, or you want to stay and keep investing for the next years?
It's interesting. I think I probably kind of think of myself as an entrepreneur still, and so I suspect I will end up building a company again at some stage. But when I was building a company, I was kind of awe-inspiringly bad at the work-life balance. Like, it's kind of impressive, and I got, you know, to the extent that I think my record, which is kind of something to be deeply ashamed of, was working every weekend for a year, bar Christmas or something. I was rubbish. I hope I'd be smarter than that now. But you have to be. I hope I'd be smarter. But I think to some extent you need to be paranoid as a startup. So you know, my wife would kill me if I did another startup now, and yeah, hopefully my kids would forgive me if I did, and they'd see the work ethic. But give me a few years before I leave back.
Okay. On a final note, how can we help you? Is there anything which our audience or us can do to help you?
just here to learn. So, you know, you've heard about some of the things I'm interested in. Keen to kind of support you guys if I can. Most of you will be based in London, which is where I live. You can get hold of me through Twitter, just Hulme. My email's tom@gv.com. Yeah, just let me know if I can help, but please be a little bit forgiving because I get a lot of emails.
We heard it. And on this note, please join me and put your hands together for Tom Hulme from GV.